Hello, IBUS 341 students. We're now going to do chapter 16, and this is the last chapter before the exam. I have unhidden chapter 15 slides and chapter 16 slides, so while viewing the video you should be able to look at the slides as we go along. This particular topic is called Sustainable Supply Chains, and the learning outcomes slide number 2 for this chapter really tells you what you have to know for the exam purposes, and it suddenly dawned on me because I was looking at the material that might be on the exam, and then I looked at the learning outcomes. It says explain sustainable supply chains, so you have to know what that is. Then there's this term called total landed cost, and we'll get into that later, but you have to know that. And then it talks about understanding greenhouse emissions and your carbon footprint. So you have to know that term, carbon footprint. There's some information about the Paris Accord, the role of scale, and then you get into understanding reverse logistics. Okay, and I think that's the new buzzword in the industry, and so that will be particularly important. But that gives you a really good idea of what you have to take away from this chapter in order to be prepared for the exam. As far as the slides go, we jump actually to slide 15 to do this chapter, and I'm just going to it, so it's on my screen. Great. Sustainable sourcing. What does that mean? Well, there's two elements that you have to know to understand sustainable sourcing, and one is what can you do in the supply chain without hindering your future needs? In other words, in terms of the economic, environmental, and social challenges or impact that your supply chain efforts have. And then the other thing is greenhouse purchasing. And this can be anything from purchasing better quality fuel for trucks and ships to better sustainable materials in the packing. So it's just aimed at ensuring that products or materials meet environmental objectives, i.e. waste, reuse, and recycling, which is a large portion of this chapter towards the end. The first thing that they talk about in the book is triple bottom line. And what this really means is, well, it's basically corporate social responsibility. Because what it means is you should not only look at the profit objectives of your company and maximizing shareholder value, but you should also look at the impact on the people involved and the planet as a whole. And then they're going to get into total landed costs. But before they do that, I really wanted to talk more about this concept of sustainable supply chains and the triple bottom line. In the past, the governments have been responsible for cleaning up the messes that companies did, and the companies only focused on maximizing profit for their shareholders. But now with corporate social responsibility, we look beyond just the shareholders, and we talk about the corporate social responsibility to stakeholders. This is a term that won't be on your exam because I'm just inputting this for your benefit. There's the corporation, and around the corporation there are shareholders, suppliers, government, environment, customers, and employees. And in the past, maximizing shareholder value meant you paid your employees the smallest amount possible. You gave customers products that weren't necessarily the best quality, but would require replacement and that sort of thing, so you could build in more money. Pay your suppliers, of course, but you would always try to find suppliers with the cheapest material possible. And then government, you try to avoid taxes whenever you possibly can, and quite frankly, I think we should all still do that. But we ignored the impact on the environment, and now towards the end of this chapter we'll be talking about climate change and the damage that businesses are doing to the environment, and we have to take that into consideration. So all these things are your stakeholders, and then when they talk about the triple bottom line, what they're saying is no longer can you just focus on the profit of the business. You really have to take charge of what's best for the climate, the planet as a whole, and what's best for the people involved. Okay, and then the next topic is what is total landed cost? And I liken this to an iceberg. An iceberg, when you see the iceberg floating in the ocean, in actual fact, you're seeing 10% of it, and 90% of it is underwater. Well, total landed cost is the same thing. In the past, we always looked at the purchase cost of the goods that are necessary to provide the product that you're going to sell to the consumer eventually somewhere down the supply chain. And the business was focusing on the purchase cost because you knew what that was. It was very certain. But now you look at all the other hidden costs involved in buying materials, making a product, shipping it to distributors who then ship it to retailers who then sell it to the consumer. And so they add in things like the inventory cost, because you have inventory that comes in that you use in order to make something, and then you make something, and then you have the inventory that you're going to sell. And the inventory costs is in a large part the storage of this material, which costs on a square foot basis. Then there's disposal costs that we don't think of. You have waste in the making of a product, and the disposal of that is a cost which we always ignored before, and hopefully tried to get the government to pick up the tab for. But then there's also the consumer uses the item, and is it something that is you then use and throw out? We were a very disposable society. I find it irritating as heck when you have a computer and suddenly it's not working very fast, or it stops working, and you just throw it out. And there was a hidden cost to the environment. Now businesses factor that in and say, okay, that cost has to be accounted for. Quality costs, again, rather than doing a cheapest product possible and expecting returns and repurchases, a lot of businesses are looking for quality materials which will last longer. Management costs have always been there, but we don't factor it in. Technological costs, quite frankly, I'm going to admit that that one caught me off guard a bit because I didn't know exactly what they mean. Technology is a new way of doing something. We always think high tech, but it doesn't mean high tech. What it means is a new and better way of doing something that you've done in the past. And so there was this technological cost in the sense that we may not be as efficient as we can be. And so when you look at that cost and then you go back and say, how can we make our business or our supply chain more sustainable, you would look for technological advantages, not necessarily high tech. But the example I use is I was a lawyer and I worked for a law practice, and that was the standard way of doing business. But I moved my business home. I became a home-based business, but I was probably one of the first lawyers in British Columbia that actually did that. And I brought new technology to an old business. And there were a lot of cost savings in that. I don't have overhead. I don't have as much requirement for office equipment and everything. And so I could actually reduce my legal expenses to the end of business. And then there's transaction costs, logistics costs, the cost of transportation, and then finally transaction costs. That's you borrow money to make something, well, you pay interest. So you have to factor in the fact that you're paying interest, or the end sale to the consumer. There are transaction costs. Every time you use your debit card, every time you use your credit card, there's a transaction cost that is actually hidden. So when you buy a product and it costs you $9.95, there's the government costs, the taxes, we all know that. But in there, you're actually not paying $9.95. You're paying more than that because you use your debit card and the bank charges you money for that. Or you use your credit card and there's a fee for using your credit card. So there are transaction costs that should really be factored into the supply chain. And that's what they call about total landed cost. So you have your tangible, visible costs, and then you have your intangible, additional relevant costs. And I think that would make a really good exam question. I haven't seen the exam yet because I have to figure out how to download it without opening it up to everybody. and so I don't know how she would ask it, but I would say something like, in a multiple choice question, there is a purchase cost which is known, and which of the following are total landed costs that you want to take into consideration. Next slide is just explains that as I was doing it. Oh, here's the multiple choice question. Many of the what total landed costs are difficult to calculate. Many costs fluctuate. Well, yeah, obviously. When you're buying inventory, buy it today, try to buy it tomorrow at the same cost. It goes up. Many costs are hidden. The transaction fees that banks charge and the payment on loans that you don't see, and many costs are difficult to measure. Sometimes something like a management cost. The management fee for the business covers many, many different things. Well, how do you figure out what part of that management cost applies to this particular product in that particular supply chain? So there are some that are just very difficult to calculate. And so D says all of the above, and yeah, that would be the answer. Okay, what are greenhouse gas emissions? Well, that's farts from cows, okay? But not only that, all right? Greenhouse gas emissions are CO2 gases that go into the environment, and there are many, many sources of that, okay? So emissions that contribute to climate change. 95% of the emissions that contribute to climate change are from CO2 resulting from the burning of fossil fuels. So, everybody says, oh yeah, well there's more cows and there's more other, what they call ruminant animals. Those are the ones that generate methane or CO2 gas that goes into the atmosphere. But that's very, very small amount to what we're burning, either to create energy in our power plants that provide electricity or in the engines of ships and trucks and things like that. The carbon footprint is what portion of that CO2 gas is caused by me. Okay, so I have a carbon footprint. I drive my car has emissions. I cause some CO2 gas to go into the environment. So what could I do as an individual to reduce that? Well, I live in Seashelt. We're quite far away from where we shop. So we hop in the car, we drive, we shop, we drive back. Or what I could do, and what we, both my wife and I have started to do, is we put on a pack, we get on our bikes and we ride in, we buy the groceries, put it in the pack, ride back, and we reduce our carbon footprint. So what can a business do? Well, the panel of people that came and talked about supply chain logistics, and you had an opportunity to go to that. And of course, I don't know you as students, so I don't know how many of you actually took advantage of that. But one of the speakers talked about empty miles and what could be done to reduce empty miles. And I went, empty miles? And I didn't know what that meant. And he said, I have a truck and I drive it to California and I pick up goods and I drive it back. Well, my truck was empty when it went down there. So really there are empty miles. And a lot of businesses are now using algorithms and working together. So if I have a truck and it's going to California and I'm going to pick up supplies, I can be notified of supplies that are in Vancouver that have to go to California. I fill my truck and suddenly we cut out one complete trip of empty miles. And so that's what that concept means, empty miles, and that's one of the ways you can reduce your carbon footprint in a business. Okay, in the creation of food, apparently you look at slide number 23, and you can see how much CO2 gas is generated to produce 12.1 kilograms of pork, and it's astounding. But what's hidden here is, well, the more cows we have, the more methane gas gets put into the atmosphere, And and there's a planet in the universe that has methane gas, and it looks blue. Okay, and as a matter of fact, I have a cup that is you can't see it now, but this is one of those cups where if you put in something that's hot, words come up, and they show the planets of our solar system because I do astronomy, and so my daughter bought it for me. But then there's this one planet, oh my gosh, it looks like Neptune that's blue. And it's blue because of methane gas. So, that's a factor, of course, and nothing can live on Neptune for a number of reasons, but one of them is we don't breathe methane. But the other problem is that just creating the food, we have to use fossil fuels, and so feeding the people is one of the creations of most of the CO2 gas. Destruction of our rainforests is one of the enormous amounts of CO2 goes in the atmosphere. Raising livestock, as I mentioned, creates methane as they digest the food. Plus, we use fossil fuels to produce the food. Decaying manure, believe it or not, from ruminant animals releases methane. Ruminant animals are animals with more than one stomach that actually have to digest, regurgitate, and digest and regurgitate. And apparently those are cows and bison and elk and things like that we use for foodstuffs, and they're creating methane gas. And then you think about gardens. Oh, well, thank goodness we grow food, and it grows in the ground, so there's no problem here. But fertilizers used to make soybeans produces nitrogen-based gases that go into the atmosphere. So even something that you would think was clean, like gardening, because we have to do so much gardening to feed the population of the world, it is creating problems with climate change. And then the other thing that's, of course, terrible for our climate is the disposal of garbage after we're finished. A banana takes 3 to 4 weeks to decompose. An aluminum can, like this one, takes 200 years. Newspapers, 6 weeks because it's paper. But then you get into something like a cigarette butt, and we should stop smoking because it would, every time you smoke, you're putting bad gases into the environment. Plus, the cigarette itself takes 1 to 12 years to decompose. Glass bottles, 1 million years. Now, I'm not certain how they calculate that because we haven't been around long enough to know, but I suppose the scientists figure out how the breaking down of silicon works on that. And then there's, of course, styrofoam, which never breaks down. And unfortunately, there's tons of that in the environment, although there are some scientists now who have developed some styrofoam that does break down into smaller parts, but then those smaller parts go into the environment as well. Then there's this thing called food miles, which is like empty miles. Empty miles is when a truck goes from one place to another empty to pick up something and bring it back. Well, that was one whole empty trip. Food miles is just the term that means how many miles is it from where you make the food to where the food is consumed. And of course, the food quite often goes into, the food's produced on farms, and it goes into a facility where it's put into a form to be sold to the people, and then it goes to distributors, and then it goes to stores, and then it goes to the consumer. And all those miles should be calculated when you're considering the logistics costs of the total cost that we discussed earlier. Which country is the highest emitter of CO2? And I don't know how this would be asked on the exam, but there's this tremendously wonderful diagram on slide number 28 that shows the Americas, which is North America and South America. And in there, the United States is the largest contributor to carbon emissions. And then they look at Eurasia, which, lumps Europe and Russia and Japan, or Japan and China together, and of course China, just because of the huge amount of their population, is the worst contributor to carbon emissions. And then they talk about the Australia area and the subcontinent, and India, and I can't read the other. India and Asia are the largest contributors there. But the diagram shows the population and the emissions. And you can see that in China, for example, because of the population, they produce more. And then in the United States, the population is smaller, but they're the disposable society. So, they're the highest contributors there. How has GHG harmed our environment? Greenhouse gases is GHG. You can see that it's rising ocean levels, increased acidity in water, and increased natural disasters. And you can have in the exam or all of the above. So you have to know those phrases. What I found really, really quite disturbing is this the one, burning fossil fuels for electricity? Yeah. This is Canada, okay? And 45% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from burning fossil fuels to create electrical energy. And this drives me absolutely nuts because hydroelectric dams are incredibly efficient for doing this. And you're using water that you're not destroying as it goes through the dam. The water's just turning the turbines that create the electricity, and then the water goes down, and we purify it and drink it, and then it it evaporates, goes back into the atmosphere, and then rains into the lakes and rivers, and we use it again. And no, we're going to burn coal, because we got lots of coal. We're going to burn natural gas because we got lots of natural gas, and we're gonna burn gasoline because we got lots of petroleum, and that's incredibly stupidly short-sighted, right? And just if you watch the internet, the Premier of Alberta, the new Premier, said we are going to back and fight for the petroleum industry and the natural gas industry. We're not going to let them stop. Make you lose jobs. And well, okay, that's fine for a while, but at some point that's going to come back to haunt us. It's very short-sighted. What we should be saying is we're going to help you reduce the amount of petroleum we use by making sure that part of your profits goes into the creation of electrical energy by water. Something like that. That's a politician. Unfortunately, that's a politician that doesn't want to get reelected, okay? The ones that suck up to the people that give us all the money to run our campaigns, those are the politicians that unfortunately get reelected quite often. So 45% of our emissions comes from trying to create energy to keep us warm in the winter. 28% comes from transportation. It's really hard to see on my screen. But one of the things that sort of struck me here was that when you talk about the transportation, a great amount of material is sent by truck, and we have rail, which is really efficient for doing it, but we have two rail line companies. We have CNR and we have the what used to be the Canadian Pacific Railway. I think, have they amalgamated? I'm not sure. But anyway, the problem is that we have this one track, and a freight train coming this way has to pull over to let a freight train coming this way get by. And the big question is, why has our government not been more proficient at saying, let's double track this? And let's use more rail because it's a lot more efficient. You have one diesel engine that can pull 150 cars behind it. And you've got one diesel truck that can carry 2 containers. Well, each boxcar is probably equal to 2 containers. So you've got one diesel engine, well, let's say 3 in a freight train. 3 diesel engines can take about 400 containers. And you've got one truck that can take 2, but hey, let's use trucks. Now, there are costs to doing something like that. The first thing you have to do is realize that there's going to be fewer jobs for truckers, and oh my gosh, we can't do that because they'll vote against us. And so rather than doing the right thing, we just keep saying, well, at some point, climate change isn't bad enough that we really have to do anything about it yet. And when we get to the next screen, you're going to see how short-sighted that is. Okay, so we need more trucks to take more goods because we have a greater population, and you can look at the average temperature anomaly on the globe, and it seems to be, increasing with fluctuations, but you can certainly see the increase, all right? And you can certainly see that it's really happened with the 1980s and onward. And the thing that drives me really crazy about this whole chapter, the thing that drives me really crazy about people that talk about, hurricanes and tsunamis and volcanoes and rising sea levels, are symptoms of climate change. No, they're symptoms of the things that show us that climate change is happening. But climate change is a symptom of too many people. But nobody in the world has the guts to talk about this. We all say, well, we have to do something about climate change, but nowhere does anyone say what we have to do is have to stop the population increase in the world. And if you took a graph like this and had the guts to show it, you could put down that the population has increased exponentially since 1950. Really got bad in the 1980s, and we now have 8 billion people on the planet. Well, how many cows do we need to feed 8 billion people? How many carbon emissions come from processing the meat to feed 18 billion people? And we're going to do something about climate change, and in the next couple of years there will be 9 billion. We're losing ground, people, but that's me on my soapbox, I have to tell you, because, hey, you look at my gray hair. I've had a very good life, and I will unfortunately be leaving this planet in a few years, but you have to grow up and you have to live here, and you'd better stop and think about this and say, okay, can we stop climate change without stopping population increase? And the answer is no, because somehow we have to feed those people. Okay, so they talk about the global greenhouse gas emissions, and here's in the top says if we had no climate policies, then that's what will happen. And then they talk about what can be done, and you can actually, with our current policies, we can slow down the increase in temperature. I hate the graph because it suggests it's getting better, but no, with no climate change, there will be a 4.1 to 4.8 degree change in Celsius change if no policies. If we have current policies, it's still increasing. Okay, it's not decreasing. The graph looks like it's decreasing, but it's not decreasing. The speed at which it's increasing is decreasing, but we're still increasing. And so I hate graphs like that. And that's the one on page 31. Oh, whew, with our current policies, everything will be okay in just a few years. Not so. Okay, what part of the average temperature in parts of the Antarctic and Arctic last week? The Earth's poles underwent freakish extreme heat, with the Antarctica being more than 40 degrees Celsius warmer than in the average in the past. and the areas of the Arctic 30 degrees Celsius warmer. And people say, well, you know, you have to realize that this is a cycle. And it will turn colder later, and the ice will reappear. Well, it's like millions of years later before it's going to turn. Okay, that cycle is not, well, you know, 2 years from now everything will be fine and there'll be more ice there. It is, you know, and so the climate change deniers can look at this and say, you know, well, it's just a cycle. And I was on a cruise to Alaska with my wife and my 2 daughters, both of which, by the way, have gone through Capilano University or are in Capilano University. And there was somebody got on in Alaska. It was an Alaskan cruise, and he talked about the history of Alaska. And he talked about climate change. And he ended by saying, but don't worry about it, it's cyclical. You know, and oh, okay, phew, we don't have to worry about it. We'll all be dead, and we won't have to worry about it. And I stopped, I got up and I left that seminar because I thought he was being dishonest. And I wondered who was paying his salary for doing this. This is the screen that you had better know for the exam, and you should probably know this for life. What are these 3 numbers? And so you have 2 degrees. Who cares? You know, 2 degrees. Well, a 2 degree increase in the average temperature of the Earth, and we'll all be dead. All right, well, what causes that increase? We are pumping 565 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the air every year. Well, no, pardon me, we are not. Mistake. We can pump 565 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the air and probably survive until the end of the century. Okay, the number 2,795 gigatons is the amount of energy in the ground that we have to burn, and that's 5 times as much as the amount that will probably kill us. And our petroleum industry and our natural gas industry and are extracting those gigatons of energy, material from the earth, and we're burning them. And so you look at that and you say, well, you know, let's burn up the 5 tons and then worry about you know, what we can do later for energy. If we burn up 1/5 of that, we'll probably be extinct. And I want to get up on my soapbox. One of the best things, of course, that's happened to the United States in the last little while is the election of Joe Biden. And he's running around saying that climate change is an existential threat. I wish this was a class that, you know, face to face, because I would ask you all to pull out a piece of paper and write on there what existential means. Because for someone who is extremely intelligent and well-educated, an existential threat means one that's going to kill you. But 40% of the American population, at least 40%, would probably go, I'm glad it's just an existential threat. I thought it was serious. Okay, because they don't know what it means. They should call it a life extinction event, because that's what climate change is. Now, I worry for my children because it's going to be really, really bad for them. But it's going to be the death of their children unless we do something about it. And supply chain sustainability is an area where you can do an incredible amount to protect our environment. Okay, there's a Bill Nye the Science Guy video on climate change, which hopefully you can access. I'm just going to see if I can.
last summer for roll.
Yes, okay. You will be able to access that, and it's one of those videos that is highlighted in the eLearn schedule that says you look at this, so you look at it for the exam purposes. The next slide is slide number 36, and it's on what is the Paris Accord. In 2015, 196 countries agreed to limit the greenhouse gas emissions to a level that would prevent global temperatures from increasing more than 2% or 2 degrees centigrade. So we can, thank goodness, we can actually increase it by 2 degrees centigrade, and then it will still be okay. No, that's the maximum. So if we're at 2 degrees centigrade and something happens, like a volcano eruption like Krakatoa, or some volcanoes erupt and elsewhere, like a series of them, and spew stuff into the atmosphere. Something in nature may happen to increase that. Okay, so I think we need a safety cushion here. The Paris Accord, unfortunately, is voluntary. Okay, so a lot of people, yeah, we can sign it because it's voluntary, which doesn't mean we actually really have to do anything. And you think, yeah, well, what country would do that? How about the United States of America? They signed it, and they were working at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and along comes somebody by the name of President Trump. Okay, I don't care what you believe about President Trump, you have to stop and think about this. The second he became president, he backed out of the Paris Accord. Well, go back to that graph which shows that they are one of the greatest producers of CO2 gas on the North American part of the world. And how serious is that? Okay. Right after that, of course, you suddenly have a president and you have a Republican-controlled Congress. The Republicans are in bed with the gas and petroleum-producing industries, and so they immediately started clawing back all those programs that had been put into effect by previous governments, Republican and Democrat, previous governments, to reduce the carbon emissions. And they allowed fracking in the oceans, and immediately we had that fracking problem in Texas. About no worry, yeah, the Gulf of Mexico can take care of all that gas or all that petroleum that's leaked. It's big. Don't worry about it. And then of course the other difficulty is that the richer countries have to commit more to this than do the poorer countries. And I don't see a problem with that because the richer countries are the ones that have been doing it the longest, okay? And the difficulty is the richer countries get to a certain standard of living, and then they say, this is great, okay, well, we can maintain this and we'll be nice. And then the poorer countries say, well, we want to get up to that standard of living. Like, why should you have that standard of living and we try to keep CO2 emissions down, and so we cannot have 3 cars in our garage, and so there's that problem, and the fact that it's voluntary. And then they look at the Paris Climate Agreement has key points, and there's 8 of them, and I would suggest that might be again a multiple choice question. They work on temperature, they work on financing this whole thing, they work on differentiation. The fact that poorer countries want to become a little bit, have a better standard of living. Emission objectives, they talk about burden sharing, reviewing. There's a review mechanism which allows them to look back and say, okay, this is what we're doing, but is that really the most efficient thing? And then they monitor climate damage. Which 5 countries in the world create the most plastic? Who cares? Let's just get rid of plastic. But it is China, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. Plastic is very harmful, and I had a plastic bottle. But consumers are now starting to look at things and say, hey, there's things that we can do. I mentioned my wife and I and our kids go cruising quite often. We on Princess Cruises, we said, we had the drink package, which allows some alcohol consumption, but it also allows you when you're going off and going hiking to just take water bottles with you, and they're all plastic. Okay. You go up into the cafeteria, and a lot of the drink cups and everything are plastic. And then that's a Princess Cruise, and we went on another cruise, a celebrity cruise, and they had all their water bottles in aluminum cans. And if you got a water bottle, you could then bring it back, and they would recycle it, and you can melt down aluminum and use it for new bottles or new containers a lot easier and a lot less expensively than you can plastic. And as a consequence, we said, well, we would look at traveling on Celebrity more than Princess Cruises because we thought they were doing something more positive to lower their footprint. The other thing that Celebrity Cruises does is they have a naturalist on board. Every time we cruise, the naturalist will come and he'll do presentations. You go in and you look at the glaciers, and they used to look at the glaciers, and aren't they magnificent? Maybe we'll be lucky to see calving, which means a big chunk of the glacier falls into the water. Big noise, big splash, and wow, it's wonderful to watch. Now they say we hope we don't see any calving, because what that means is the glacier is receding because the temperatures are increasing. And the naturalist actually tries to educate people, which, and so we think, hey, Celebrity's, better than Princess Cruises that way. Okay. The rivers that pollute the ocean, most of them are in China and Indonesia and the Eurasian countries, or the Asian countries. And, they go, well, why is that? Well, look at the population. And you can see the start in India because their population is, as far as I'm concerned, out of control. Where does this stuff go on land? We collect it because we sort of trip over it, but a lot of it goes into the ocean. How many of us trip over that, except on the beaches? And on slide 39, you can see that young lad that's there, and he's collecting stuff off one of the beaches. And how could you go swimming there? And would you want to use that water for anything else? What can be done? Well, not very much about those garbage patches that are floating in the oceans because they're so big and it's so hard to extract it out of the ocean because of perils at the sea, because of the damage it does to the ocean wildlife. And you have to have specialized equipment, so those patches of garbage that are floating out there are getting bigger. Okay, how many gyres exist in the ocean? You might want to just check that number for exam purposes. How are they created? They're created by garbage being thrown into the water, and the bottles float out. Now, what countries are reluctant to tackle these gyres? Most countries, because there's a cost, and it's hard to do, and hey, we didn't create all of it, so why should we be responsible for cleaning it up? Why does the plastic not sink in the ocean? Some of it does, but plastic is just the shape of the bottles makes it float, and sometimes the lids are on, it makes it float, and sometimes the plastic itself is just lighter than the water. And on slide 43, it shows the biggest areas where we have this garbage floating around, and not surprisingly, two of them are between two of the largest are between China and the United States. There's an estimated of 200 million tons of plastic littering our oceans, and 100,000 garbage trucks would be necessary for dumping the trash in the ocean. A lot of countries used to do that. That's how they got rid of it. Hey, it floats out of the tide and it goes somewhere. It goes beyond the environment. Not into another environment, beyond the environment, which is just a total lie. Okay, there's a video, The Great Pacific Garbage Patch. You should watch that. And then there's microplastics. This is one of the most dangerous aspect, and the microplastics are eaten by the fish, and the fish die, but like, who cares? There's lots of fish, right? Well, as our population increases, there are places on the planet where the fish are being literally fished out because we're taking too much. Around Newfoundland in Canada, for example, tuna. They they fished and fished and fished and fished to supply Japan predominantly, and now there's a shortage of tuna fish. So the microplastics get eaten by the fish, and the fish die, and those fish are eaten by bigger fish, and they die. So it's serious. Okay, and then it says, let's have a 10-minute break. So I am going to have a 10-minute break. We don't need it in a video, but I'm going to do it because I want to go and get myself another cup of coffee. Okay, so I just have to find out where my screen is. Okay, I'm back after the break, which I needed, but you don't when you're watching the video, or actually maybe you do, because you can only stand my bobbing head for so long. One thing I wanted to mention was, unfortunately, because of my clashing class times, I cannot do an online Zoom session for the lectures, which means that you have the disadvantage of not being able to ask questions, which in my case is probably a good idea, because I probably wouldn't be able to answer them having not taught the course before. But there is that downside. But then the upside is that you can always ask the questions by email, and please feel free to do that. The other advantage is that you have to take notes, right? Because the slides have been indicated in numerous spots that they're not notes. Well, when you're taking notes and you miss something, the nice thing about a video is you can rewind and watch that portion again. And of course, the other advantage is that, gosh, I missed that class, and then you have to get notes off somebody else. Well, with a video, how can you miss the class? So just keep those things in the back of your mind. All right, I'm back after the break, and the first slide that we're going to look at is the slide number 48, and it says the link between economic growth and transport growth. And it's not surprising that there seems to be some correlation. The more economic growth you have, the more transportation you need to get all those things to the marketplace for consumers. And so there is this very close correlation between the two. Of the different modes of transportation, which one produces the most greenhouse gases? Slide number 50, you had better know for the exam. Road passenger cars produces 45.1% of the gas emissions. Road freight produces 29.4%. Aviation produces 11.6%, and shipping by ship is 10.6%. So obviously, the best way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is get the gas guzzling cars off the road. And in the United States has said, by I think 2030, they plan to have most gas cars off the road. The danger here is exactly what happened when they moved from big gas guzzling cars down to smaller cars to improve gas mileage because of the cost of fuel going up. The United States did that. They did it very, very effectively. And then what happened, of course, is that people would buy smaller cars with greater gas mileage, but then their second car would be a truck, okay? And then the motor car companies had better fuel-efficient engines, so suddenly you get these SUVs, bigger and bigger and bigger, and the next thing you know, those benefits that we got from getting the big gas guzzlers off the road have disappeared. Partly because of that, and partly because of the increase in population and the fact that we all need cars. I have two daughters. In our family, we actually had three cars when our kids were small. We have, a Yaris, and we have a Caravan. The Caravan is easier to get the kids in and out of. The Yaris, you would just whip to the store to buy whatever. And then I have a 1993 Mitsubishi Dodge Colt, which I had to keep in North Vancouver so that I could live on the Sunshine Coast and still commute to Capilano University. So here's, two people having three cars. Now, the only good thing is we can't drive all three at the same time. But our kids grow up, okay, and suddenly here we are with the three cars, and they each have a car of their own. And so as the population increases, the demand for cars increases, so we're not likely to see a dip in that 4.5% very quickly. The other problem or danger is, and I think this is important for you to keep in the back of your mind, I'm up on my soapbox, so I doubt this will be on the exam, but if they got all those gas-guzzling cars that we're using now off the road, and we have electric cars in the United States and Canada, where are those gas-guzzling cars going to go? Well, if they went into the garbage pile, then you have this problem of, more garbage. But what happened when we got those gas-guzzling cars off the road earlier, and we started buying smaller, more economical cars, those gas-guzzling cars were sold to developing countries, for very inexpensive amounts of money, and suddenly we've reduced our gas consumption, and they've increased theirs. And so I think, if you look at the global market as a whole, there was probably an increase in the use of gas. The other thing to take from this particular slide is that sending things by ship is the best way to go, because you can put a lot in one ship and take it there, whereas if you put something in a truck, well, trucks are limited by their size. Aviation, very expensive. So if we could reduce the passenger road vehicles and increase shipping in other ways, then we would be better off. Because there is this little green line on that screen that says rail. Well, we could use rail much more efficiently if people just turn their mind to it. And then the purple line at the end is the transportation of resources by pipeline and things like that, okay? So the key there is, I think, to look at the possibility of using ships more and perhaps rail more. Okay, the next slide is sustainable supply chain. And there's three ways that you can improve the sustainability of your supply chain. And one is supply chain redesign. Okay, you've got the system in place. Well, what can we do to redesign that to make it more efficient? And then there's promotion of scale, selling products in bulk as opposed to small amounts. And then you can enhance efficiency in certain ways, and we're just going to get into those right now. So let's look at supply chain redesign first of all. You can actually get about 80% carbon savings by doing that, but it's only achievable if you do it at the design stage as opposed to trying to take your supply chain and change it after it's been in operation. However, with the expanding requirement of transportation and supply chain because of the increasing population and demand, there will be a need for more warehousing and things like that. And so you can do a lot of what they call forward planning. Some of the redesign is, your location of warehouses and your distribution centers for more efficiency, deciding which transportation modes to use, using more rail, and things like that. So, one of the things is reconfiguring the distribution networks. And there's a diagram on slide 54, showing the United Kingdom and what they did there. Initially, they had most of the materials coming into the country, coming into one very significant port on the East Coast. and then going to a distribution center and then being delivered from there. And so what they've done is they've opened up a number of other ports closer to other portions of the country, and then the goods come in there and goes directly to the places where they're going to be sold, rather than going to a distribution center and then going out. So you can do that. It moves in bulk as far as possible downstream, rather than having it come into the port in bulk and then going into small bits and heading out. And port-centric shipments, locating the distribution centers at the ports rather than a distribution center in the middle of the country. So that's how you get supply chain efficiencies. Supply chain scale is just the way you distribute the product. And to use the Tide example that you can see on slide 55, I can remember when we used to have the little bottle of Tide, and you would put some in your washing machine, but now you have this big container and you just push the button and you get this little cupful and you put it in. So you go to the store once and buy it rather than going to numerous times to the store, and so that at the consumer end makes a smaller carbon footprint, but also at the distribution end you can pack those big containers much more efficiently using less materials to pack them, and you can carry more of those and again cut down on the carbon footprint. Which country recycles plastic bottles the most? I was surprised at this. It's Norway, and they recycle apparently 97% of all plastic bottles. And what you have to do is you have to build in incentives. First, the more companies that recycle, the less they pay the taxes. That's an incentive to the companies. If they can reach a collective nationwide target of more than 95%, then they don't pay any tax at all. And then the second is the consumers have to have an incentive to do it. The incentive for the aluminum bottle was just we didn't get anything back out of it except a really good feeling that we were doing something. But there's a lot of other examples where you have you can buy milk in those waxed cardboard cartons, and you use the milk, and then you try to recycle the carbon, the wax-covered plastic containers, but it's very hard to do, and so we actually buy cream and our milk for our coffee in those glass bottles. We pay a huge deposit on that. Like one quart bottle, we pay $1.50 in deposit. But then we take it back and we get a credit for that the next time we use one, and we take it back and we get a credit the next time we use one. And so it's much more better. God, that is good grammar. Much better for the environment than the other containers. Those big plastic milk jugs, finally, they're starting to say, okay, rather than crushing them and putting them in the recycle bin and having them go to the place where they're going to be melted down and used again, and then along the way some get thrown in the garbage and some get used for holding old paint and stuff like that. What they do now is they have a deposit, and you actually can take them in and get your deposit money back, and you have to pay a deposit when you buy it. So incentives for the consumer are really important. So that's the beginning and the end. How many of you have recycled a product in the last 6 to 12 months? Well, I enjoy beer. Okay, I admit it, and I recycle those cans all the time because, hey, there's an incentive. And there's two places I can do it. One place where I can take it, for a nickel, and or I can take it to the liquor store and get a dime per can. So there's lots of incentive to do that, but it's amazing how many people I see actually just dispose of the cans because it's more convenient. I caught my youngest daughter doing that. She was living in a basement apartment in her house while she was going to university, and I would come out and get the recycling done, and then I would take the garbage bins out to the curb, and quite often I would find beer cans or the other drinks, like you can get vodka in cans and stuff like that, flavored stuff, and I'd find them in there, and I called her on it, and I'd take them out and recycle them, because if they go into the garbage, they go into the landfill. Much more convenient to just throw them out, but you have to think ahead. Every little bit we do helps. Sometimes I get frustrated when I think, well, I'm recycling this piece of cardboard, but is it really making a difference? 8 billion people recycle their cardboard. Yeah, it's going to make a difference. Okay, so why is reverse logistics historically ignored? First of all, we have to figure out what reverse logistics is. The screen 60 could appear on the exam very easily. At least blank % of online orders are returned as compared to blank brick and mortar stores. So I go in and I buy a shirt, and I get home and I go, oh, you know what? It doesn't fit right. So I take it back to the store. Well, online, I buy it online. It gets delivered to my door. I go, oh, darn, it doesn't fit. And it's a lot easier, believe it or not, to return it online than it is to go into a brick and mortar store. And so you shouldn't be surprised on the next screen where it says 30% of all products ordered online are returned, as compared to 8.89% for brick stores. Why are they returned? 80% because they're damaged in transit. 64% don't match the description. And 37% is you don't like it when you get it. That doesn't happen in the store as often, because you're actually there and you see the product. 7% because it's delivered late, and then just 7% because it's poor value. These things happen. We're putting a railing on the deck of our new house, and we have this nice glass railing that allows us to enjoy our view. And it was delivered from the States. There was 12 big, huge, flat boxes of the glass that goes in the holders, and one of those is broken. And so we go, okay, to the business. One's broken. You have to send us a new one. And they said, okay, throw out the old one. So you have all those little bits of glass, and we're going to scoop it up, and it's going to go into the landfill. And glass takes, as you know, 1 million years to disintegrate. But online, things are returned, and that does present an opportunity for reducing your carbon footprint substantially. Forward logistics is you get the materials, you make something, you ship it to a distributor, the distributor ships it to the store, and the store sells it to the consumer, and the consumer uses it and then throws out when it's empty. Reverse logistics is the idea that you have the forward logistics process, but then rather than something being thrown out, it comes back into the system, and then it can be used for resale, or it can be recycled, or eventually scrapped if it has to be. The screen number, where am I? 62 has a flaw in it. And that's the reverse logistics services. When you see those red arrows of where it goes, there are more arrows than that, and we'll get into that and explain it a little bit better in a minute here. But reverse logistics is defined on slide 63, and it's the flow of materials from the end consumer back to the original supplier or manufacturer in the order. So it goes back for either reprocessing or disposal. And the nice thing is, even if they're disposing of it, they will dispose of it in a more environmentally beneficial manner, okay, or hopefully. quite often the businesses will outsource the reprocessing or disposal to other businesses, but that doesn't matter. It's the reverse logistics that you have to take into consideration. What key areas would be different between the forward and reverse logistics? This is a very hard screen to understand. I sweated over this quite a bit, so let me see if I can go with you. Forward logistics on the left, reverse on the right. Straightforward forecasting is a lot easier because you know the cost of this, you know the cost of shipment, and you know the cost of the consumer. Forecasting is much more difficult if some of that is going to be returned, because there's the cost of it being returned, and then it's going to be recycled in some manner or disposed of, and there's a cost there. So it's a lot harder to figure out the forecasting. One shipment to many distribution points, but when it's being returned, it's many customers to one distribution point. So that's just the reverse of each other. Destination routing is clear when you're just selling it like that, but when it's being returned, quite often you find out it's being returned somewhere else. We bought a unit for the bathroom from IKEA. It was either IKEA or Amazon, and it malfunctioned. And so we said, okay, it was being returned because it's not working. And they said, we'll send you another one. And that's the forward logistics, comes from Amazon. And then they said to return it, you have to return it to another place. Well, that was difficult for us because then we had to get instructions how to return it, who to contact, and things like that. So sometimes that's not as clear as possible. The uniform pricing, very easy for forward logistics. Pricing depends on many factors in reverse logistics, because the price that they sell it to you can actually vary depending upon how many returns they have and whether those returns can then go back into the business cycle and they can recover some of that cost and hopefully drop the price to the consumer. Consistent inventory requirements, you know exactly how much you have to get in order to make the product to sell. But if you're bringing in stuff to make the product and the product goes out and then the product comes back and you can fix it and sell it again, well, you need less of this, but how much less? It's a lot more difficult. Negotiation between the straight parties in forward logistics. Hey, you're the distributor. How much are you going to cost for me to ship it to you and have it distributed? But in a reverse logistics, it goes, here, you're the distributor. How much is it going to cost? And they'll say, well, it depends on how many returns we have and where it's going and back and things like that. So these things are different. Reverse logistics, one method of sustainable growth is increasing the amount of materials you can recover. They used to throw out tires off your car, and they would go into landfills and they would be burned, and they would burn for weeks, and there'd be black, ugly smoke going into the air. Well, the companies then realized that they get the material to make the tires, and then the tires are disposed of and burned, and they buy new material. Well, wait a minute, there's this big pile of material there. Why don't we bring it back and reuse it? And so the waste is reduced, and the costs is also reduced. A reverse logistics network can either be closed or open. Closed loop or open loop. What's that mean? Well, if I'm the maker and I go through the supply chain and it's sold to the customer, and then there's things that I can recover and reuse or dispose of better than the consumer can, and these come back to me, that's a closed loop, okay? Because I'm doing the product and I'm doing the recycling. But in an open loop, what happens is the product goes to the consumer, and then the consumer returns it to another business who then uses it in a different way to make another product that can be sold. Or it comes back to me, the producer, and I say, okay, I don't want to do anything with it, but I've got this other business over here that I can give it to and I can recover some money. And that's what's called an open loop system. Reverse logistics networks, open loop, companies use recovered materials themselves. In a open loop, it is either them use, they don't use it, they give it to somebody else. And what we're talking about here is repair, reconditioning, remanufacture, recycle, or dispose. Okay, so repair, we got, in our new house, we got some curtain rods from IKEA. And when we got it, the package was broken. And so we said, okay, we're returning that. And then what they do is when it comes in, they repair it for us and give it to us, or they recondition it and resell it. And then there's other times when something goes and then it comes back and it's remanufactured, okay, which means that they don't take the existing item, like a refrigerator, and repair it, or they don't bring in that existing refrigerator and recondition it and make it functional again and then sell it. What they do is they bring in the refrigerator and they dismantle it, and all these little components go to be used in the making of a brand new refrigerator, remanufacturing. And then recycling is slightly different. If you have a computer, there are computer chips in there, and the computer chips are very valuable. But you have a very old style computer, well, maybe those computer chips have some other use in some other, like a tablet or something like that. So what they do is they take the thrown out computer and they take it all apart and they find those parts that they can use, and then they provide it to somebody else in the way of recycling so that they can then use it in something else. And then there's obviously some things that you just cannot reuse, and so you just have to dispose of the waste. Okay, slide 70, we've already covered that, closed loop, open loop. Reverse logics network, we're looking at slide 71. In an open loop system, companies using their system might assume the responsibility of collecting and finding markets for the products. So, I'm basically rid of it, but there's some return amount of money that I can make, and I pass it on to somebody else who will then use that and make a profit from it. What factors influence the success and failure of reverse logistics? Basically, it's three, and that would make a really good exam question. Legislation. The governments just legislate that you have to do this. They do that with pop cans, and beer cans, and wine bottles and liquor bottles. They just say you have to do that. The consumer demand can influence it, and again, I hold up this bottle. Other cruise ship lines will start doing this as well, I'm sure, because good ideas go various places. Okay, and then the last is incentives. This is the pop can money. It's one thing to legislate. The companies have to actually take their beer cans back. They have to take their bottles back. They have to bring their cans back. It's another thing to make the people actually return them, and that's where the incentives come in. The incentives can be to the companies themselves, or it can be to the consumer. And I have an example of that. Let me think this up. There are products that the government says, okay, we will pay you so much money if you recycle that. And then the company gets onto the consumer and says, okay, can you do that? So there's incentives at both ends. Recovery options in reverse logistics, make sure you review these for final exam. That's what it says right there. Make sure to review these for a final exam. So reuse policy. Products is used again for a similar purpose. This is the Coca-Cola bottles. Hard to find now, but if you go down to Mexico, they can return them for reuse, but they don't, because there's no incentives to the with the consumer. But in Canada there is, and the same thing with the aluminum cans. They can bring them back, and they can't refill the can, but they can then melt the material down and make new bottles. Okay. What you have to do though is when something is returned like that, you have to inspect it and clean it. So there is a cost to that. You inspect the bottles because you don't want any crap inside it, and also you don't want chipped bottles. Okay, and then you have to clean them and sterilize them before you can use them again. The pallets for carrying goods. When we did our house. We had 2 huge pallets that our siding came with, and when we were finished our house, unfortunately for us, our contractor disappeared, and so suddenly we were left with the problem that we had these pallets, and we had to get rid of them. Now there are companies that use them and then recycle them. But we found out that they wouldn't just come and pick up our pallets because our pallets wouldn't fit their needs, and the company that actually uses our pallets to ship the materials just said no, we're not going to send a truck to your house to pick up 2. So we couldn't we couldn't have the company reuse these, and so I'm going to skip ahead to recycling. When we built our house, we always have a garden, okay? And so we thought, okay, we build our garden out of wood, and we fill it with dirt, and we plant our garden in there, our vegetables. And so we thought, okay, we got the wood. And so we actually just put the pallets on the ground and then built up the sides, and so we recycled the pallets. Now businesses can take them back and recycle them, but the consumers can also do that in certain instances. Say, going back to, so there's the reuse policy, which works with some matters, and then there's the remanufacturing policy, where focuses on the value-added recovery, not just the material recovery. The product often is completely disassembled, and then involves 3 stages: disassembling, inspection, and reassembling. And that happens quite often with like the curtain rods we had. They were damaged, but they come in like 5 different parts. You've got your rods, you've got your connectors on your rods, you've got the things on the end that stop the curtains from falling off, and then you've got all the hanging mechanisms. Well, the rods were bent, okay, so they cannot reuse those, so they would be recycled in some way. But all the other material's good, and so they would take the hangers for the wall, they would take the end caps, they would take the connectors, and they would use those they would inspect them and then reuse them in creating another, remanufacturing the product to be sent out again. Recycling, as I mentioned, you have collecting, disassembly, the used product, and then separating them into the categories such as plastic, glass, and things like that, and then reprocessing them into some recycled materials of a different nature. Considered to be the least value-added recovery process since it doesn't retain the functionality of the parts. There are, sometimes when you get something back and you disassemble it, there are parts that just cannot be used in other things, and so those have to go into disposal, and that's the problem there. The success of recycling depends on 2 things: whether or not there's a market for the recycled material. Okay, so you bring all these, aluminum cans back, and then what do you do with them? Well, some company says, okay, we'll buy that based on the weight of the material, not on the functionality of the can. We'll remelt it and make new cans. And so, okay, there is value there. Some things are returned and they have no value, like hunks of styrofoam that doesn't fit any other packaging for another product. And then you have quality issues. What's the quality of the recycled material? Okay. Key performance indicators, KPIs, key performance indicators: reuse, remanufacture, recycle. Reuse is the time required for the product recovery. The beer cans they recovered very quickly because I drink beer very quickly. Other items take a long time before they're actually returned, and things can happen. Businesses can go out of business. Businesses can change hands, stuff like that. Remanufacturing, the percentage of the reusable materials available at the end of the product life. So, and again, when they go in to demolish a house now, they will actually go in and they will say, okay, there are plugs in the wall. There's the plates that go on the plugs. There's hanging rods for sliding doors. There's all sorts of things that they can recover, and how much of that is reusable. So in the percentage of the house, probably not a lot, but particularly because when they take it apart, things like the insulation is really hard to deal with, and yet now businesses are actually collecting that and reusing it. And that happened when we were building our house. They buy these big pallets and they put the insulation in the wall. They come down, there's 3 inches there that isn't any good. They cut it off, they throw it in a pile, and that would generally go to the garbage dump, the landfill. But this company called up and said, we're going to swing by. There's 3 houses being built there. Do you have any insulation? And they would come by and they would take it away. They'd take it away for free. But the key for us is that we don't have to pay to dispose of it. Okay, and so it was a benefit to us and a benefit to them. The volume recovered and the percentage of the volume recovered and the percentage of the product disposed of in recycling is the key. So you should know slide 78 for sure. Why is reverse logistics more complex to manage than freight forwarding or forward logistics? Obviously, on slide 79, using 6 aspects: the environment, forecasting, purchasing, type of inventory, production planning, and logistics. When you look at those, forward logistics, there's the forward flow, no returns, and demand-driven flow. But suddenly in reverse, it's forward flow and reverse flow. No returns in the first, but there are uncertain quality of returns in the second. Pardon me, and then the third, demand in forward logistics is demand-driven, and in reverse logistics, it's supply-driven. How much of what can we actually get back in the way of a supply? And then slide number 80 is, that's it, folks, okay? And it says, thanks for attending my lectures. Obviously, that is from Azita, but thank you for also listening to my video and looking at my bobbing head. I'm just looking back through the textbook. On page 271 of the textbook, there was something that I think might be important that wasn't in the materials online, and that is table 16.1, improving road hauling logistics efficiency and reducing environmental penalties. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bullets. The first is reducing empty running. That's the empty miles that I was talking about. Increasing the vehicle payload capacity. Improving the routing using GPS and things like that, so you aren't driving around looking for the place. Pardon me. Improving the vehicle design. Improving the vehicle routing. GPS is a godsend. There was we were living on a road called Solaz Place on the Sunshine Coast, and there was a Solaz Place on Vancouver Island, and we got a call from a delivery company, and they said, okay, we're here, where are you? And we said, well, where are you? And they said, we're in just outside Campbell River or someplace like that on the island. And And we said, well, no, we're on the Sunshine Coast. And they said, well, aren't you on SOLAS? And I said, well, yeah, we are. We're on SOLAS, but, you know, SOLAS on the Sunshine Coast. And so GPS is a real help because they went online. Well, the difficulty there was our road was so brand new, it wasn't in GPS, and they found this other road, and they thought that must be it. But when we were building our house in Seashelt, it was already an existing subdivision, and all the delivery trucks, you know, when we were talking to the companies, and we said, okay, we want this item delivered, and we would say, okay, can we give you directions? And they would just say, no, we've got it in GPS. And so they don't waste time going to Vancouver Island. More efficient use of packaging and loading of containers. To give you an example how that works on a smaller scale, when we moved from our place to SOLAS up to the place here, we had to move a house load of stuff. And we could hire a truck to come and make numerous trips, okay, lots of CO2 going in the atmosphere, or what we could do is we could ask a truck to drop off a container at our house in SOLAS. We open the container, we cram it full of a whole bunch of stuff, we close it, and they come with one truck and they take the container up here. We actually had to make a couple of other smaller trips with a truck, but instead of 5 or 6 trips, I think we made 2, and then just a few carloads. Okay. Improved vehicle driving. There are now computer programs that monitor the driving so that drivers have to maintain a very efficient speed on the road, or their bosses get upset. You see the truck cabs with these big, instead of just a boxed truck, they have this the curve at the top. That's for more wind efficiency, and all sorts of things like that you can do to improve road hauling. And that's significant, but you have to go back to that screen where it talked about cars, trucks, trains, and ships, because you can improve the hauling costs much more significantly if you can use ships to move things across from one continent to another, and if you can use rail to move it across a country. The United States has a very good railroad system, but the unions, the Teamsters unions, are so strong that they actually put pressure on those politicians down there to not use the rails as much as possible. And there are trade-offs. For example, there's a suggestion that they could actually have ships that use wind power and sails to actually move at a much reduced cost. Like, it's not, you're not going to just have a big freighter with wind sails on it, but what you'll have is wind assist, and that sounds great. Yeah, let's all do that. But the problem is you have to maintain that greater than 18 knot speed in order to reduce piracy. And so it's a trade-off. You have to decide the benefits against the costs. One thing they can do is they can have smokestack scrubbers on all the freighters, and the smokestack scrubbers would actually scrub a lot of the CO2 or carbon emissions out of the smokestacks. The problem with that, of course, is that a lot of these companies are resistant to that because it also reduces the efficiency of the ship, and it costs them money to install it, and it costs them money in the way of running costs. Okay, thank you very much for your patience. You watch the video, you look at the slides as you go along, and then if you have any questions, you can email me and ask me. That's sort of what I'm going to wind up doing with your presentations, because you're supposed to send to me your slides so that I can watch the slides or so that I can mark the slides. But what we can do is, pardon me, because I'm going to have you do the video, I will have the slides. So if you were making a presentation to me on Zoom, you would open up your slides to me. But what we can do is, when you do the video, you can actually just say this relates to slide 7, and then I will have on another computer your slides open, or maybe on another window on my computer, and I'll be able to look at the slides. Okay, so that's just how we'll deal with that, but I'll send out more information on that later. Thank you very much.